Right, good afternoon. My name is Carl Watts. I'll be a moderator today for this seminar series. So we welcome you all, or those who have took the time out to support this particular presentation. Today we have Mr. Curtis Wallace, who will be presenting on the establishment of the Jamaican Constabulary Force in 1866. All right, just a quick overview of who Mr. Wallace is for those who aren't familiar. Mr. Wallace is a research student in the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, Mona. He holds a Master's of Arts in History from the UWI. This was actually done on his research paper was actually done on the history of the Jamaica Historical Society. And he's currently pursuing studies for the MPhil PhD in history. Generally speaking, he is interested in the history of crime and punishment in Jamaica and the wider English-speaking Caribbean, and has completed papers examining the nature and perceptions of Caribbean law enforcement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So currently, the main focus of his research is the history of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, which is much needed. It's a long-standing institution since 1866, and we see today how it is responsible for upholding law and order in our society today. So an institution that has transferred from the colonial period into independence. So Curtis should be able to shed some important light on its origins and the extent to which it has made adjustments in the new era of independence. So, and in terms of his career, Curtis has served as a humanities lecturer at the Monique College in St. Anne, and is currently also a research assistant in the Department of History and Archaeology at the UM Moni. Right, so Curtis, so the presentation today will be about 30 minutes. Remember to leave your questions in the chat room, and then I will then have Curtis respond and so on. So Curtis, I now turn it over to you, so you can go ahead and share your PowerPoint.
All right. Thank you very much, Carl, for your introduction. And before I get into my paper, I just want to do some quick acknowledgements, thanking the Society for the invitation to make this presentation. Thanks also to Monique that has allowed me to be off on secondment to UWI for the last 8 months or so, and that has allowed me to do much of the research that I'm going to be presenting this afternoon. And also want to recognize the Institute of Jamaica and the library at UWI, who, although we're going through a pandemic, I think they really put their safety and health at risk to accommodate me on a number of occasions when I needed to do research. And I want to acknowledge their help. And I also have some family members who are here who have been very supportive of me throughout this challenging time, including my mother, and I would like to acknowledge her here. So this afternoon, the presentation, as Carl indicated, is on the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and the title of the paper is Creating a More Militarized Force, the Establishment of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, 1866 to 1867. I'll just bring up, not bring up here a logo which was created, or this was created at the 100, I think it would be the 100th anniversary of the force. And this picture was taken at the library, which is at the National Policing College at this time. And this image here is showing some mounted troops on parade, and it gives us an idea of the kind of militarized ethos that the force had then and continues to have also. In terms of my comments, I want to say that in recent years, the militarization of police in Jamaica and other parts of the world has attracted significant attention in the press and also in other arenas. And just to highlight some of that, um, just in this year, we had a gentleman, Jason McKay, who I understand is a member of the Jamaican Constabulary Force, or in fact, he serves as a district constable. He wrote a paper, wrote in the newspapers about crime, combat, and militarization of the police force. And there he spoke about the use of special weapons and tactics teams, SWAT teams, um, and he said that was necessary because of the murder rate that the country has. We also had recently in the paper an article by the Gleaner, an editorial piece, and this, I think, released a kind of storm of comments about militarization, and this is where the head of the army, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead, came out in support for joint police military operations under the states of emergency to deal with crime and violence, and he was saying we should treat crime like COVID. Now, what some persons, such as the editors at the Gleaner, responded, and they were saying that that approach ends up often violating important fundamental rights, and they were warning against the danger of militarism. And all the way back in 2003, Lloyd Barnett, a noted constitutional lawyer, attorney, raised concerns about that as well. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that militarization, or if you want to talk about militarism as a broader concept of policing, is something which is very much on the table now as an issue that is affecting us here in Jamaica. And if you go overseas as well, in light of the killings of Black persons overseas and the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, there are issues there also. But importantly, or before I go there, what we notice is that the arguments for and against militarization, they line up. This is the lineup that we usually have. Usually, what we have is security personnel and government officials arguing that militarization is an effective way of maintaining public order and protecting citizens and security personnel. Critics, and these are usually persons in civil society as well as academics, who claim that militarization is in fact not as effective as these officials claim. And I just want to, these are some of the studies that have gone on in the United States. My apologies for that problem. There are studies on this in the United States. I'm not so sure that there are many studies here in Jamaica, and I think that anyone who is in the social sciences, it is something to look at to see whether or not militarization is working as a strategy for dealing with the crime problems that we have in Jamaica, and whether or not there is approval of that approach to policing also. Importantly, the discussions, just to take it now to my topic, is that these discussions are not new, right? The whole matter of militarization and whether or not that is the correct approach to policing is something which would have gone on from the very foundation of the Jamaican Constabulary Force. There were debates and discussions about whether or not that is the form the force should take from its inception. And so basically what I'll be doing this afternoon, using primarily colonial office records and contemporary newspapers, is to examine that process of militarization and those discussions and debates which took place in relation to the process. To be more specific, these are my objectives: to look at what type of policing existed before the JCF, why did people want to see a change, the models that were available to them, and the steps that were taken to establish a new force, the new system, what that was like, as well as to analyze those discussions and debates. Now, that's a lot, and I have about 30 minutes, but we will push through to see how much I can get through. And my primary argument this afternoon will be that between 1866 and 1867, while there was general agreement that the system of policing in Jamaica needed reform, there was no consensus on the appropriateness and effectiveness of the paramilitary model that was used in establishing the Jamaica Constabulary Force. So to begin with, before 1867, that's when the Jamaica Constabulary Force was established, there were two policing models that were used. There was a civilian model and there was a militarized model. And the civilian model was a model which focused on peacekeeping. The militarized model was something which emphasized violent conflict. Civilian police, they were persons who were often from the community. They were largely unarmed. They wore no uniform, and they belonged to organizations that had a relatively flat structure. Militarized police, on the other hand, were often imported into the communities. So these were persons who did not necessarily come from the communities. They don't live there. They are brought into the communities, and they made use of armaments, attire, tactics, and organizational structures developed in and for the theaters of war. So militarization is something which is basically you're bringing in, as I said here, all of the strategies and so on that are used in war into policing, policing communities. And this is a table that I developed. It's something I would say is a work in progress, which kind of highlights some of the differences between militarized policing and a more civilian model of policing. And it's important that we know, as I said here, that in terms of the equipment, notice that little to no weapons versus the use of guns and bombs and a variety of other weapons, as I said before. That's involved in terms of the, let me start from the top. The function is civilian is more preventative. The militarized approach is more suppressive. The civilian model is more about peacekeeping. Violent conflict is more on the militarized model. A flat organizational structure for the civilian model. The militarized model is generally more hierarchical. The personnel are more community-based in the civilian model. The militarized police are usually from outside. No uniform versus uniforms, weapons versus, or no weapons versus weapons, and consensual policing versus an approach that is more coercive. Now, the first police that we had here in Jamaica, and when I say police, we have different people doing policing. But when I say police, I'm talking about persons who are officially appointed by state officials. Because you can have private persons doing policing, but the term, when I use the term police here, I'm talking about those official individuals. So the first set, up to 1834, we had petty constables and night watchmen. And in terms of their duties, the petty constables were responsible, were required to take up malefactors, as I say, or suspected persons and slaves without tickets. And the night watchmen were expected to use their best endeavors to prevent mischiefs arising from fires, murders, burglaries, robberies, and tumultuous assemblies of slaves. So this is during the period of enslavement. And as I said, these persons were appointed by the local government, the vestry. And importantly, though, these men were untrained and they were unarmed. As far as I am aware, I haven't met any evidence which suggests that they received any training or that they received any official arms. Maybe perhaps they carried their own arms. And originally they were unpaid persons. So they were like, they were originally somewhat like volunteers in the field. But what is it that turned what changed to result in a more militarized force was the Sam Sharp Rebellion of 1831, 1832. And I have a picture here, this is a painting by Adolphe Duperley, showing the destruction of the Rokhampton estate in 1832. So the rebellion was actually a war. It is often spoken about as a rebellion, but in effect it was really a war. And Beckles and Shepard argue that it was the largest kind of it was an emancipation war, and it was the largest war of its kind in the Caribbean. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this war, it lasted for about a month. There were island-wide disturbances in the western end of Jamaica, and they also extended to the east. The enslaved persons actually formed a militia, a black militia. They were armed and they engaged in fighting the British Imperial Army and the Maroons. And there was massive destruction of property and the loss of life. Damage in the amount of approximately £1 million, over 900 enslaved persons, along with 14 whites and 3 mixed race people were killed. So this was a massive war, very destructive. And as I said before, it was only through the involvement of the army that the rebellion was able to be put down. The local militia nor the police that were operating at the time, they were not able to put down this rebellion. So in light of that, the colonial authorities decided that they were going to create a more militarized force so that it would be ready in the event that there was going to be any further insurrection of the nature of the Sam Sharp Rebellion. And we see here that it was created by the Act of William IV, Chapter 28. And this force now, the persons, the members of this force, the men of this force, they were all armed, the Handbook of Jamaica said, and accoutred. They had a captain and a lieutenant, and they had an ensign that was placed over every 75 of the men for the purpose of enforcing strict discipline and taking command. And the island was divided into townships, and detachments of these men were sent out to the different locations. But it's important to note here that there was a kind of civilian element still. So we had a movement from a civilian force to a more militarized force, but it was not entirely militarized, in the sense that the colonial authorities encouraged these men to actually have their families located in the regions where they were posted and to engage in some kind of agricultural activity. And it seems to me that one of the major concerns of the authorities was the fact that there was a deficiency in white people and they felt unsafe in those environments. And so they wanted to increase the numbers of white families across the island. They weren't getting enough persons, and so they actually tried to recruit men from overseas, and they were in particular Germany. They tried to get persons from Germany, and groups of Germans arrived here between 1834 and 1836 in response to what is called the bounty immigration scheme, European immigration scheme, but they weren't sufficient. And so that was really abandoned in the end, and they continued with the local persons that they had in the police force. There was another turn towards civilianizing the force when they eventually removed the military titles, and for the officers, and kept those for the other persons. And they also changed the organization of the force. They had, instead of a captain and an ensign and so on, they had inspectors. But to a certain extent, that was a kind of, I would say, cosmetic change, because the functions of the force still remained very, very, militarized, and they were still expected to put down any revolts that were taking place. And along with this force, though, there was a civilian constabulary that was formed in 1864. Now, by 1866, there was another turn. And what we are going to see now is more militarization. And just like in 1834, when the turn was influenced by a violent uprising by the people, in 1866, we are having another violent uprising in the form of the Morant Bay Rebellion. And that is what really pushed the turn towards further militarization. And again, I have a picture. This is a painting by Barrington Watson highlighting the bloody conflict that took place in Morant Bay. And this was something which the police really could not handle. The police force at the time could not handle this. The militarized force that existed from 1861, they couldn't handle it. The peasants marched from Stony Gut to Morant Bay. They overran the police station at that location, and with shouts of war. And this is one of the things now, people don't characterize the Morant Bay Rebellion as a war very often, but we do have scholars. I can't remember his name just now. He wrote, I think it's Color for Color, Skin for Skin. I think it's Clinton Hutton who wrote that book, and he has characterized the rebellion as a war. And the peasants, they took over St. Thomas for approximately 2 days. And again, just as in 1831, where it was the army that had to come in and put down the rebellion, it was the army along with Maroons again who had to come and put down the Morant Bay Rebellion. So with that situation, the authorities were again looking at the failure of the police, and they were considering making changes. And they blamed the failure of the police on a number of things. One, they said that the structure, the organizational structure of the force, where you have a situation where it was you had the police in different parishes operating on their own. The war secretary said was a problem because they were there was no central command that could really organize and coordinate the activities of the police. He said that was a problem. Another one said it was because police were being located in their own parishes. And Sir John Peter Grant said the reason for it was because the vast majority of the police that were in the force were extremely poor. They were sick, weak, they were old, they were of bad character, and they did not really deserve to be in the force. And so eventually what we have, and by the way, there were also, if I should just go back, there were also persons in the establishment who were saying that the force consisted of lazy, ignorant, and worthless officers and low and incompetent privates. So they were calling for a change, and they blamed the failure at Morant Bay on some of these systemic issues and personal issues in the force. Now, they had two models that they could turn to. They could turn to what is a paramilitary model that, that was in England, the Irish model, where the force was armed and trained to operate as agents of central government. And to really put down rebellions. Or they could choose the English model, which was more a civilian model. The force was unarmed and generally upheld the principle of the police are the public and the public are the police. Ultimately, though, they chose the Irish model, and this was primarily Sir John Peter Grant, the new governor that was appointed under Crown Colony government that was implemented following the Morant Bay Rebellion. And Sir John Peter Grant said it was because of the character of the people. Grant had this idea that although the country was in a relatively calm state after Morant Bay, he had this idea that the people were, and this is not him speaking here, but Patrick Bryan wrote this. He said that they had some kind of potential for I can't pronounce this word, incendiary and insurrectionary action, that they were very combustible. And there was a kind of racial element in this because he was talking about Black and colored people. And because although there wasn't a lot of crime, there wasn't any, the place was generally calm, but Grant had in his head and others had in their head that the people had this potential for uprising, and therefore there was a need for a force that would be ready to put them down in the event that there was a revolt. Grant was also a man who, he had served in India before coming to Jamaica, and there he had set up police forces and so on, and he wanted to carry over that into the Caribbean, into Jamaica. Now, in terms of the steps that he took to set up the force, one, let us look, he was very militarized. One, military men. He appointed a military man to head the force. That is J.H. Prendeville, who was from the 3rd Jamaica Regiment. And then there were also men that were coming in, ex-servicemen and Maroons, who we know have a military ethos and some kind of military training as well, and they were a part of it. He implemented military training at the depot in Spanish Town. That wasn't there before. He brought in military weapons, Enfield rifles, were acquired from the imperial government for the new recruits. And this is a picture here of a constable in drill. And you can see military uniforms as well were there. You can see some.
5 minutes here, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl. Right. So we can see, and this is a picture of the depot in Spanish Town, which is now in ruins. Right? But what was the response? There were some persons who were happy about this. One, the Morning Journal said, well, if the efficiency of the constabulary were to be determined entirely upon their training in military evolutions, the public would have the fullest guarantee of efficiency. So they were excited about militarization, but there were opponents to it. And the colonial standard, I'm not sure you are able to see this, they were saying that the promoters of the bill have not reflected on the material from which the men are taken. Because what they believed is that the men were taken from the black and colored class, and if you train them in what they called military evolutions, then these men would then actually quickly leave the force. They would go out there and they would use their military training to participate in uprisings. So the colonial standard was opposed on that basis. The journal responded and said, no, that would not happen. What would, in fact, what is important is that the colonial authorities take care of the social and economic issues in the country in order to prevent rebellion. Keeping weapons away from the people is not going to be going to stop rebellions. And furthermore, they said armed police would serve as of a deterrent effect on the people, and that the men of the force would actually become more disciplined through exposure to military training. So ultimately, though, the colonial authorities really didn't pay those, the naysayers, if you want to say, use that term, any mind. They went ahead and they set up this militarized force under Law 8 of 1867. And these were their duties. And what I noticed is that the duties were largely civilian. So even though the force was so militarized, it was largely civilian, and you had persons who recognized that, and they were saying, well, why is it that we're having a militarized force with all of this civilian militarization? And so you had, again, I probably missed this. You had the colonial standard and others saying, you know, all of this is of no effect. And all of the epauletted men and so on, they are not trained to actually carry out the real duties of policing on the ground, that the training was much too focused on military activities. Unfortunately, I can't do much in terms of actually reading some of those quotes. But as I close, what we realize from this process is that the establishment of the JCF was really represented an increase in the militarization of the police, and the old force that is from 1861 was transformed through the promotion and institutionalization of military leadership, military training and discipline, a kind of military administrative structure. We had military ranks being used in terms of organizing the men, military equipment and attire, military style deployment and accommodation. The men were sent to different places and they were placed in barracks. They did not live in their communities. And the proponents of this strategy argued that militarization was going to be effective in creating disciplined police, maintaining public order, reducing crime, securing the state against insurgents, and protecting citizens and police and police personnel. The critics said this is not going to happen. It's doing little to improve public confidence and safety, and also to reduce criminal activity. In fact, they felt that it was a dangerous approach to policing. And so between 1866 and 1867, while the stakeholders, all of them basically agreed that there was a need to improve policing in Jamaica, there was no consensus on the most effective way to achieve this objective. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Curtis, for that very engaging presentation, very informative as well. I'm sure some of us would have learned a lot about the continuous debate between militarization versus the civilian model of policing. Okay, so do we have any questions or comments?
Hello, Carl. Yes, there is a question in the chat from Elizabeth for Curtis. There is the aspect of realization in terms of racialization, in terms of the transition from white police to black on black surveillance and intervention. What commentary existed on this over the period of your research?
No, in terms of the transition from white to black, oh, let me see if I can see that. The question is in the chat, you said?
Right.
Yes.
What sort of commentary, what were people saying about this transition from white to black police?
All right, so I didn't get a lot on that, but as let me just bring up one of the comments here towards the end. I think this highlights what the question is talking about. One of the things that concerned the authority, not so much the authorities, I think more so the colonial establishment, is that there was a fear that the black and colored personnel in the force would actually, through the training that they received, the military training that they received, would use that against the colonial authorities and white people. So there was a concern in some sectors about actually having black people doing the policing, right? And so they didn't want these men to be armed. But on the other hand, there are other members of the colonial establishment were saying, if we actually train these black men to respect hierarchy and so on, because all of the officers were white in the early days, then we would actually help to create disciplined persons who, both through their actions and example, would prevent any kind of uprising. I'm not so sure if that answers the question, or if there's something else that you were trying to tease out from me in relation to that.
It does seem similar to some of the commentary on the Black West India regiments during the slavery period.
Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, do you consider that a satisfactory answer to your question? Or do you have any follow-ups that you can share?
I do. I put a follow-up in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can see it.
One of the most pernicious aspects of the colonial experience, rather like the use of enslaved overseers. Agree, Curtis?
I'm trying to see the comment. Oh, I need to stop sharing screen. Oh, you mean using their own people? Um, and yes, and it was necessary because certainly there weren't enough white persons to join the police force. Their numbers were small, and in addition to that, many of them would not want to go into the ranks of the force because the pay was also quite poor. The working conditions were poor. So most of them wanted to be officers. So there was a need for the colonial authorities to actually include Black and colored persons in the ranks. So in terms of social control, this would have operated at different levels. First of all, the authorities would have had to ensure that they had control over those entrants to the force, and in order for them to then control the rest of the population. And those who argued in favor of militarization suggested that the exposure to all of the drill and so on and military discipline would control those entrants and make them respect white authority, white colonial authority, and then they would be effective in carrying out social control of the rest of the population. Yes. So that's a very insightful comment there.
All right, Curtis, we have another question from Edward Darling. He's asking, between 1866 and 1867, did this new police system still use the assistance of the Maroons? They still have the Maroons in their service.
Oh yes, Maroons were actually joining the police force. Sir John Peter Grant, in a letter to the colonial office in I believe it was 1868, he noted the types of persons who were coming into the ranks, and he spoke about artisans. He specifically mentioned artisans who apparently were they formed the majority of the recruits who were coming in. But he specifically mentioned that there were ex-soldiers, and he said Maroons, and he said the Maroons had never been in the police force before. So in the police forces which existed prior to 1866, there were no Maroons, but after when the JCF was formed in 1867, they started to come into the force.
That would be a follow-up to his previous comment where he said that the Maroons are traitors. So having such individuals in the police force probably serves to reinforce its colonial makeup as an institution. Marcia Thomas said also that if the Jamaican police force model could be understood, that they were militarized, as Ireland was the model that was based on the Irish one utilized in Ireland, for instance, that they were militarized as Ireland was a colony and a rebellious place. I'm wondering if Marcia is seeing here that it was justified to utilize the militarized model of policing.
No. Can I intervene? What I'm saying is that they use the Irish model for the Jamaican police force, and if the Jamaican police force was then militarized, it could be understood, because Ireland was a colony of Britain for 800 years and was very rebellious. Therefore, the military the police force in Ireland would have been one trained to put down rebellions. And if that's the model they use, then it goes without saying that that's what they would have for the Jamaican force.
Okay, so you agree that it was so are you agreeing that that was the right model to employ? That's what I'm asking.
No, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing that it was the right model. I'm saying that it therefore goes without saying that the police was then militarized because it's based on a military model from Ireland.
But if I may just jump in here, they, as I said, it wasn't the only model that was available. There was the more civilian model that existed um, in England, the London Metropolitan Police model, and this model was being used in colonies elsewhere. But there was, I think, a desire from Sir John Peter Grant to use the model in Jamaica because of his, I think, his fear of the people coming after 1865. The fear of the people that there was some uprising. And interestingly, though, he said in 1866, when he started this process, that there was very little crime and that the place was quite peaceful and calm. So he could have on that kind of evidence decided to go with a more civilian model because he's saying the place is peaceful. But at the back of his head, and I think at the back of the heads of a lot of the persons in the colonial establishment, was this whole idea that Black people are prone to excitement and insurrection, and that at some time this was something that was going to happen, and there was a need to have the force ready to put them down in the event that it takes place.
Okay, so we have also here Rosie, who is saying that well, it's in the form of a question. Surely Black Jamaicans also benefited from having a police force that brought about law and order. What do you say to that, Curtis?
Well, I mean, even Black Jamaicans wanted a change in the force. In 1865, when well, just before the start of the Morant Bay Rebellion, the peasants in Stonygut were calling on Governor Eyre to actually do something about the police. But they were not calling for a more coercive or militarized force, interestingly. What they were calling for is for a police force that was actually more understanding of them and their rights. The peasants, in fact, complained about what they called the impositions. I think that's a term. I hope I'm not misquoting, but there was some term about the impositions they were being imposed on by the police, and they were calling on Governor Eyre to actually do something about this. And they said that if Governor Eyre did not do anything about it, then they would be forced to put their shoulders to the wheel and make a change for themselves. I think that so they wanted a change, but they did not want a change to a more coercive force. They wanted a force that was more respectful of them and their rights.
Okay, I've seen one last, well, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Elizabeth is asking here, do you have information about the kind of buildings that were constructed as police stations as well as prisons?
Okay. I don't have a lot on that, but in my, if I want to call it field work, so to speak, I'm not an archaeologist or of any sorts, but I've visited some of the older police stations right here in St. Ann, where I am. For example, the St. Ann's Bay Police Station. There's a police station in Claremont as well. I know those 2 police stations. There's one close to me in Yuatan. All of those stations were built in the 1800s, and they tend to be quite imposing. One of the things that I have noticed is how imposing they are, And another thing that struck me is how they are positioned in the town centers, and they are next to the what you said, the prisons are connected to them. The church is near, the vestry house is near the Anglican church. So basically, what the police station would have represented the coercive arm of the colonial administration, the church representing a kind of cultural arm of the administration, and of course the political aspect being there. So and they were very imposing buildings, quite imposing. So there was a kind of symbolic role that they played in terms of projecting colonial authority, symbolic, and I would say also kind of not so, a kind of a role in terms of surveillance. They stand tall, and from there the police can actually look around and see what is happening, in addition to actually going down on the ground. So that is what I would have gotten from my look at the buildings. As I said, I am not I'm not too deep into that kind of thing, but it's something that I hope to certainly explore some more in terms of the JCF.
Okay, another question, but we have time for about one more. Would you say, this is according to Rosie, would you say that the police force remained militarized from its inception to the current day? You know,
right.
Make room for civilian policing.
Mm-hmm. Right, very good question. As I said, the militarization doesn't normally it exists. It doesn't normally exist by itself. It exists on a kind of continuum depending on the force. So you have some forces that are more militarized than others. And what we saw what so far, what my research has revealed, is that over time there were attempts to include more civilian elements in the JCF. So for example, between 1867 and 1870, the only type of training that took place at the depot was drill. There was no training in civilian policing. But later on, we find that there was the infusion of that kind of training. And then further, after 1945, when we were moving up to independence, there were further moves to include more civilian elements in the force. The training, there was a shift in the training. Women were included in the force to deal with a lot of the social issues and so on. But fundamentally, the military model has remained, and you see that in terms of the attire, the ranks, the the training. It is still fundamentally there. And in terms of the personnel, I mean, every now and again, an ex-army man becomes the head of the JCF, and I think that a lot of that goes back to the kind of military ethos that that they want to promote within the force. So there are civilian elements, and there are constant efforts, I think, to include those in it. But I think fundamentally at the base of the organization is a kind of military culture that has not left the force.
Okay, Curtis. So that civilian model, does it have any bearing on? All right, so the civilian model would have been preferred, for instance, in the earlier period, because there was little crime or violence or violent activities in that period, apart from the flare-ups associated with, say, Moran Bay, for instance. Mm-hmm. But what about today? Some would argue that we're living in a violent society. Do you think the militarized version is the preferred method of policing right now?
Right. A very good question again. When I considered that, I looked first at Ireland, and there were violent conflicts over a 100-year period between the the Irish Constabulary and the Irish persons and the Irishmen up to the 1920s. And when Ireland got some, I think, some measure of independence of sorts, they got rid of the RIC, that militarized force altogether, and they actually have now a civilian force, which is, they are called the Guardians of Peace, which has remained largely unarmed from the 1920s. Now they moved on. Jamaica, in spite of the various changes that we have gone through politically, we are still at that stage. And I don't know. I think there might be a need for some military element in some cases, but perhaps it is too much in other cases. There is that kind of issue that is on the table now, and I think there is room, lots of room for persons in the social sciences to do some further investigation on a matter like this, and to produce some study to see whether or not that kind of policing is actually working or it's not working. I know the officials are going to say yes, that is what they like, but I think some independent studies need to come forward to give us some other perspectives on what might be the best model for Jamaica.
Okay, we're on a tight ship now. We're close to the end, so I'll now turn it over to Bernadette, Miss Bernadette Worrell, who will be giving the vote of thanks and the closing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Carl. Thanks so much to everyone who broke their afternoons to spend this last hour with us. I'm glad to see so many friends that have actually turned up, and I'm sure that you would have found this session quite informative, and the discussions afterward really does show that it was impacting. So that leads me to thank Curtis. Wow, you've really shown, you've really brought such a different element to our relatively quiet team member on the executive, but that was actually quite thrilling, Curtis, and I'm sure everyone would agree. Thank you for sharing all of that. We look forward to hearing what your final paper pans out to be, and I'm sure it will be well received, and I wish you all the best with that. Thank you for spending this last hour with us and being so accommodating, because we would usually have two presenters, but we figured that his research would be so fulsome that we could give him a little more time. Thank you, Curtis. And the members of the executive, we have a few with us today. Thank you for all your assistance with putting our 6th webinar together. It has been quite a year, but we've been able to continue engaging our friends, our members with the webinar series, Decolonizing Jamaican History, and Unfinished Project. Thank you for everyone in terms of creating our promotional material, the development of our flyer, our able moderator, and we're all so happy to be guided by our president, Elizabeth Pigu Dennis, who is also here. I want to encourage everyone, I placed in the chat earlier or website link speaking to membership, but you can explore the website in a more fulsome way, but I want to encourage you to become members of the society. So please, I will place the link again in a second, but I'm encouraging everyone to renew or begin their membership anew. And thanks again to everyone who actually turned up. Please continue to remain safe, you and your families, and to remain dry for the rest of the day. If there are no other comments, I will quickly drop again in the chat the link to our website. And if our president or moderator has nothing else to add, I will. No, Carl, Elizabeth?
No, Bernadette, thank you very much. And thanks to Curtis.
Thank you. Thanks to Carl as well, Nicole. So with that, we will wrap up our session. Please look out for other webinars. We will continue the discussions as we try to promote Jamaican history. Have a safe afternoon.